Good afternoon, everybody. Dr. Calabria, I think you made a good point there at the end. Well, made a lot of great points, but one of the things he mentioned was about this panel here. And I think the question really shouldn't be, will private capital fill the gap? It's how will private capital fill the gap?
Yeah, so the way I kind of think about it is the marketplace has dealing with two structural problems, right? The one you're alluded to is the footprint of the GSE, right? Mm-hmm. They basically, whatever box they design and they want to play in, they have a funding advantage, they have a regulatory advantage, they control the services, you can't compete.
Right.
Okay? So everybody else has to play around that box. The second structural issue is that the instrument, the private PLS structure, really hasn't worked.
Right.
Now, I want to be positive here and tell you, I think there is no doubt in my mind that private capital wants to get in the space. You alluded to all the amount of money moving in whole loan market, right? Why are they doing that? For a very simple reason. They have access to information, they design the contract, and they can enforce the contract. They control the servicer. Right? If they don't like how the structure works, they have to only blame themselves. So they're trading off liquidity to get into that control. Not many people can do that, and that's really the problem, right? You're losing liquidity, it's not repeatable on a massive scale, so it works for a handful of the investor, but it doesn't work for everyone, and that's what we need to solve.
You know, in terms of bringing investors back, I mean, there are a couple of things, right? I mean, I think most investors can be bought. They may not admit it, but they can be, right? But I think from a policy perspective, you know, spreads would have to be much, much wider, I think, to bring investors back into this asset class. And I think that's something that policymakers, frankly, haven't really wanted to hear. But I think that's a necessary precondition of bringing investors back, unless they make significant changes to the market. I think the other thing is that it can be addressed with structure. There's still an indulgence, I think, on the part of issuers and underwriters for highly customized bespoke structures, because that's how you optimize the ARB at the end of the day. But I think if you really want this market to come back, I think there needs to be more homogeneity in the structures. I think you have to resist the siren call of you know, playing silly structuring games like, you know, running bogus pricing speeds and things like that, and create a more homogeneous market, but also, you know, creating simpler structures, and you can add, you know, more structural enhancement that maybe brings back a more conservative investor to the top of the capital structure. And then the last piece, you know, assuming you don't want to do any of those things, is I think you really have to address the regulatory construct. And I know some of the other panelists, or I heard some of the other panelists this morning talked a lot about investor distrust of you know, the regulatory construct and a lot of the third-party service providers, but I think it's hard to overstate the amount of distrust that a lot of investors who have been in this market over the last 10 years have to you know, third-party service providers and also regulators who you know, keep finding, you know, they keep finding the third-party service providers with their hands in the cookie jar, and instead of holding them responsible, you know, they cut a deal to split the cookies. And you know, there are cookies, there are clients' cookies, and I think
that's
that
right. They're ours. They're 401k and pension plan.
And I think until, you know, that is really recognized, that the damage that is done to investors' confidence in the sanctity of these contracts, I think it's going to be hard to bring them back without much wider spreads.
So ultimately, to bring investors back, you need a scalability issues, you need certainty of what you're going to get. And this talks about standardization, but it's not, I give you a standardized bond. It means it has to work as intended. If I buy AAA, I should get AAA. I should not have an army of analysts to figure out which AAA is truly AAA, which one is not.
It's not just like loan limits, and I agree with the prior statement about you need time. It's also a matter of degree, right, in terms of the market. You know, could the current market absorb another 10 billion, 15 billion, 20 billion? Yeah, I think so. I would agree. I mean, the deals we're doing, they're many times oversubscribed. There's lots of demand. You know, when you go to these conferences, right, many of the investors who are in this room, you know, they're not necessarily talking about certain nuances. They're talking about when's the next deal or why aren't there more deals. But, you know, I don't know if you'd have that, or I think I can confidently say you wouldn't have a zero reaction if all of a sudden it was 100 billion.
Right.
Like that's a totally different size and scale. So I think you have to be careful with sort of how much you unleash and how much time. The market is very efficient. It will fill in over time, but you need that time and scale. Most people, and I heard a lot of talk in the earlier panels about, home ownership and the sanctity of home ownership and all this sort of the feel-good stuff. I mean, the reality is, when rates are flat or going down, I mean, a lot of the market is cash-out refis or beach houses or ski houses. So I don't think people are necessarily saying like, that newlywed couple shouldn't, achieve the American dream. That's a part of the market, right? But I think a lot of people would also say, is a guy doing an $800,000 or $800,000 house and a $600,000 cash-out refi, is that what tax dollars are supposed to be supporting, right? Is somebody getting their third investor property or their second beach house, is that what the market's supposed to be supporting? I think most people would kind of say, I'm not so sure, right? So I think a lot of people could sort of get behind the newlywed couple. I'm not sure if as many people are behind beach houses and ski houses.
There's always going to be this debate, should we change the status quo? And it's always, a very, very tortured question, especially when you're also dealing with houses and social architecture and the importance of the policy discussion. But if you look at what just played out in a much smaller scale in the multifamily market, which we heard Dr. Calabria mention, there were effectively some caps put on the multifamily. We've seen more than enough supply and capital to come into the multifamily market to effectively be the off-taker of that risk. I don't think anybody here in this panel certainly, or in the audience, would be suggesting a falling off the cliff. But I think there's a good constructive case to be made that long term, the private capital with appropriate boundaries and appropriate responsible action should effectively provide capital to this marketplace so that capital prices risk appropriately. And within that, clearly, there is going to be a segment of housing that has to be supported by public policy. And then the question is, what is that? And I think we'll also directionally agree that it's a lot smaller than what it is today, that should be supported by public policy.